Great to see all of you again. Thank you for coming back. I am Katie Andreas. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School.
Okay, well, thank you. It's really wonderful to be here, and thanks to the organizers for just pulling together such a fascinating conference, and to our panelists, who we have a really great set of papers to discuss. So we're going to be hearing from Amy Kipchinsky from Yale and Joel Michaels, who's formerly of Yale, now serving in the administration, and nothing he says is on behalf of the administration, I will say, as a former government lawyer. And Andrew Hammond from Indiana University, Sally Omarova from Cornell, and Zach Lisko from Yale. And since we have a lot of panelists, we'll jump right in, and I think go in the order that you all are listed in on the program.
Great. Joel and I wrote this paper together. I'm going to start off, and then and he'll pick up the second half. So this is a paper broadly about industrial policy, and that is because, sort of setting the stage broadly, we live in these precarious times, and I think part of what joins some of us in this room is sort of thinking about like what's beyond neoliberalism, what kind of political economy might we build, and we're also in this very fragile moment politically where lawmaking and change are quite hard. And so one reason for the sort of focus of this paper is that one thing emerging for a sort of contender in some people's minds for what comes after neoliberalism is industrial policy. I guess I should say at the outset that we think that's a problematic view insofar as industrial policy can be done in many different ways, some very consistent with sort of corporate power, inequality, hollowed out democracy. But also understood broadly, we think it can name an important vision, which is that we design the economy. And the big question is, how can we do that consistent with democracy? And so the paper is trying to provide a framework for thinking about that question, as opposed to answers to particular fights about how to reconcile democracy and industrial policy, but a framework for thinking about it. And sort of the setup is sort of this. We have these big debates about how to administer the new Inflation Reduction Act and other pieces of industrial policy coming through the reconciliation process. So all these fights emerging, should we have set-asides for unions and project labor agreements? Should be involvement of community groups, or are these diversions from the purposes of industrial policy? And so for these purposes, you need to know what industrial policy is, and whether it's good, and also how it can be democratic. So we are also interested in this paper and thinking broadly with this conference, like what are paradigms for thinking about democracy in the administrative state? So oddly, in the realm of industrial policy, at least its more distinctive tools like grant making, contracting, public forms of public ownership or public shares, there's very little purchase that traditional tools of administrative law, the kind of notice and comment, rulemaking, or adjudication have. There's a little bit of a kind of black hole, not a lot of scholarship on this kind of activity of the administrative state. And so we think that kind of makes it an interesting opportunity as a place to sort of think, well, what structures of accountability might work in these settings where, for example, I'm thinking of Nick's work, we have a lot of guidance in this context because you can't do rulemaking. It's too fast and there's too much interaction with other parties, including like really well-resourced private parties. So we're trying to intervene in these two debates, or what is industrial policy and is it good? And also something about sort of how to administer it in a democratic way, and in conjunction with these questions about the future of administrative law and the administrative state. I won't talk a lot actually about the what is industrial policy part of the paper, which is a long section of it, just to say that the way we think of it, the best definition of industrial policy is the deliberate attempt to shape different sectors of the economy to meet public aims. And we're doing a couple of things here. One is it's not about manufacturing, right? It can also be about childcare and healthcare. And it also is to meet public aims generally. It's not just to make things efficient or competitive. And so you can see how this interacts with LPE conversations. You could also call this developmental policy. That might even be a better name for it. So how can this kind of policy be democratic? That's really, I think, the appropriate focus for today. So one thing that we start out noticing is that the industrial policy literature, there is one that's sort of defending this against the assault of many neoliberals who said like, oh, you shouldn't do this. This is very bad. The state is not capable. Defending this, but a lot of the way that it's defended is with respect to sort of an insulated bureaucracy, or a bureaucracy that is, there's a lot of preoccupation with how does this bureaucracy get information, is connected with industry players, solves market failures in coordination. I'm also thinking here of industrial policy work like Mariana Mazzucato's, where she calls for mission-driven economy and public production, and that can be very top-down itself, as if we just sort of design these things and then go. I think what our instinct is that this is a problematic sort of tendency in the literature about industrial policy, because it is in danger of sort of doubling down on the idea of just an insulated expert state that is not accountable or truly shaped by the public. And so the puzzle is, like, how do you think about an industrial policy that really would meet public aims, if that's how we think it ought to? In a democracy, it ought to serve democratic aims. And so what we try to do then, the sort of, in a way, one of the main moves of the paper is to say industrial policy that to administer industrial policy to meet democratic aims requires you to do two things. One is to build administrative power, or the capacity to shape the economy effectively, and the other is to build countervailing power. And so we're borrowing this term from Kate and Ben's paper, who are borrowing it from a longer literature that goes back to Galbraith on countervailing power. But then broadly, so building administrative power, this piece is about the fact that we lack administrative capacity inside of government, particularly after many decades of sort of divestment of administrative power inside of government. And also that we need to think about the organized power of groups who are not well represented in our democracy, in order to and building that kind of organized power, like, you know, Kate and Ben starting with unions, but bridging out from that, not only unions, but other kinds of poor and working class people and communities that are not well represented in government. And we need to build that organized power in order to have an effective form of influence over both the state itself, so the administrators administering industrial policy to help set some of those aims that are not commonly, in fact, fully set out in statutes, but also to countervail the power of the private industry that's being fueled by industrial policy. I guess a broad piece to say here is that we're thinking about democracy. There's many traditions of thinking about democracy, but we think there's a lot of overlapping traditions that would share our conception, which is that democracy requires governmental capacity to achieve public aims. So this is in the Deweyan tradition. And it also requires attention to material deprivation and its impact on the ability to exert power over government. So we're thinking of the work of people like Sam Bagg, Steve Klein, and also the evidence that many of us cite about the systematic exclusion of poor people and people of color from the political process. So I'll say a little bit about so part of what the rest of the paper does is try to actually map these two terms, administrative power and countervailing power. What tools do administrators actually have to try to do these things, to try to build administrative power over the economy, and what are going to be the legal issues that they are that they come across? So broadly, to build administrative power over the economy, we need more and better information and capacity to shape the economy. So there's a piece of this which is about better data generation, and government investment in the production of data about the developmental sectors that we're working in and around. And so we also can, so this can be done directly by producing data. It can be done also by commanding or requesting or conditioning government grants on giving industry giving data to the government. The other thing that this section of the paper is trying to do is describing a continuum of control that we don't have, I think, enough of a language for talking about. So a continuum of control that goes from things like government ownership back down to government conditionalities v. contract and things like that, and also to specifying different kinds of ownership. So one thing that's fascinating about government ownership is that there is no single form of government ownership. Government ownership, if you look into the literature on like what is a public corporation, it's everything from Amtrak to the Boy Scouts, because there's a private incorporation statute, but there's no public incorporation statute. It's whatever the public determines the features of that institution are. So we're trying to sort of, and calling for like a reinvestment in thinking about like, what's the difference between having public ownership and of which kind versus public options or public shares or public owning of patents or data, and the way that these things might affect how also practically navigating around the legal barriers that might exist, we can exert more control over economic order. That, of course, has to be paired with this countervailing power piece, which Joel will now talk about.
Thanks, Amy. So as Amy said, when we talk about countervailing power, we're drawing on Kate's work with Ben Saxon and a tradition before them about leveling imbalances of power. And here we're talking about imbalances of power specific to the terrain in which industrial policy decisions are made. And we think that requires specifically lifting up groups who are implicated by the consequences of those decisions, but are systematically shut out of meaningful influence. And I think there are three ways that we try to spin this concept of countervailing power that we think are sort of novel and unique to the industrial policy context. One is that we think that when administrators are exercising their discretion, they should be thinking about building countervailing power and leveling those hierarchies of influence, not just in the domain of governmental administration itself, but also in the operation of those spheres of the economy that the state is seeking to influence through industrial policy and the allocation of resources within those sectors. The second thing we do, again, drawing on Kate, is emphasizing the importance of associational power. That is, the organizational capacity of structurally disempowered groups to exercise a collective will in a form that's legible to the political processes that they're intervening in. And the third is that we think this power-conscious approach requires a level of individuation that regulators are sometimes uncomfortable with, that it requires regulators identifying the specific groups that aren't represented at the table and then using their discretion to bring them to the table. And what we spent a lot of time doing in the last part of the paper is offering a host of tools that can structure the exercise of the discretion to do this in a power-conscious way. I want to talk through some of the counter arguments to this approach that we think about in the paper. A classic one that we get is, how do you pick, or how do regulators pick what groups are disempowered in a particular context and who should be brought to bear? A key point to remember at the outset here is we know from a great deal of empirical work on the notice and comment process, on ex parte participation in rulemaking, that the status quo with respect to influence over regulatory outcomes isn't neutral at all. And we should evaluate counterfactuals relative to that. We should evaluate proposals relative to that counterfactual where there are certain groups that are structurally empowered, rather than claiming this is a deviation from a neutral terrain. The other thing we think is that this is a question that we tend to overcomplicate, particularly in the industrial policy context, that there are obvious cases that when we're designing industrial policy around how to retrofit buildings to be energy efficient, that community college students who are training to be the HVAC technicians who will ultimately service those buildings are not empowered over decision making in the way that commercial real estate interests are. And to figure out a way to get those former interests to the table is an important function of administration. And we also think for non-obvious cases, there are ways that administrators can facilitate political debate about what those hierarchies of power are and who should benefit from industrial policy, which is, after all, the first order question that theoretically industrial policy or developmental policy is supposed to be answering. Why do we care about this sector and how it operates, and how are we seeking to influence it? A second thing we think about is how to prevent empowered groups from becoming clientelistic factions that improperly steer the goals of industrial policy or exercise power by delaying projects. The problem of NIMBYism, as some people call it, in which Zach will talk about it in a different context in his paper later. We think here that sometimes industrial policy inherently threatens those kinds of clientelistic lock-ins when it delivers subsidy to private actors to empower them in a particular sector. So the goal here isn't to ignore those lock-ins, but to create an alternative set of civil society actors that are capable of counterbalancing them in the domains where allocative decisions are made. And government can do this, for instance, by using its power over conditionality to require incentivize recipients to recognize union contracts, or give additional carrots if those recipients negotiate community benefits agreements with organizations representing a certain percentage of local residents or things of that nature. The issue of delay is a really hot topic, but one that we think isn't inherent to this kind of associational power over decision-making, and is instead one of institutional design. So we're not really interested in this paper in mechanisms that give disempowered groups opportunity to block programs through litigation or ex post forms of control. We're interested in how to give them power at the outset over where those dollars go, and powers over in the spheres of the economy where those dollars are already, have been allocated and utilized over to what productive ends they ultimately serve. So I want to close by returning to the second debate that we intervene in that Amy mentioned about the future of administrative law. So if the archetypal instrument of administrative law as we understand it now is an agency responding on equal footing to all comments on a proposed regulation in the final rule preamble, the premises about countervailing power that I just outlined lead us to a very different set of interventions that are both conscious of which particular societal interests are participating in decision-making and structured around enabling disempowered groups to organize inside the administrative state itself when they're not already there and present and capable of exercising influence. So just to give one example of the way we understand this can work, we talk about the way that government contracts with people networked into particular communities can help administer a program by gathering information or enforcing program rules. But we don't think that the best way to award such a contract is through a competitive bidding process necessarily. Of course, government should be attentive to cost and efficacy, but these kinds of relationships with organizations that are networked into communities can be a way in and of themselves to cohere diffuse and disempowered groups who are affected by developmental policy or other regulatory functions into an apparatus that's capable of participating in the design of policy. And we talk here about the community navigators that were funded through the Affordable Care Act to get folks enrolled in healthcare and raise problems related to enrollment up to administrators as an example here of how this can be done. So just to put a final gloss on what we're trying to do here, if we imagine sort of a 2x2 matrix, if you will, of state capacity and civil society capacity on the two axes. If we're, with respect to industrial policy, starting out from a place of weak state, weak civil society in that quadrant, we think that we need to move to the opposite one, the empowered state, empowered civil society quadrant. And when we think about what procedures we should attach to industrial policy decision-making, we think the best way to approach this is to work backwards from creating the shifts in political economy that enable us to move there. Thanks very much.
Great. So I think I'm next. I just want to echo what folks said earlier today about how different this feels from a traditional administrative law conference and how refreshing that is. And I also want to say and that's thanks to the organizers and the other papers and all of you for being here. But also, I just want to add on a personal note, 5 years ago, I was on the entry-level job market and trying to make the case that I can write about civil procedure and administrative law, but motivated by questions of poverty and economic inequality. And it was kind of tough sledding at some schools. Like, I was fine, don't worry about it. But there was one hiring chair who was the most encouraging on that, and that was Kate Andreas. So it's pretty wonderful from my perspective just to get to participate with her and have her as a commentator a few years later. So I'm going to try and do three things. I'm going to try and situate my paper in a broader book project. I'm going to then summarize the paper, and then I'll tell you kind of three things I'm continuing to wrestle with the paper. So I'm embarking on a book project that's thinking about climate adaptation of the welfare state and particularly means-tested programs. I signed a contract with Cambridge last month, but I don't owe them the manuscript for a very long time. This is all to say I'm very open to feedback on the chapter and the book project more generally. The chapter that you have access to is the third chapter in the planned project, and focusing on climate strains. But here's how I get there. The reader, my imagined reader, but especially the literature, tends to focus on climate impacts related to extreme weather events, or what I call climate shocks or climate fueled disasters, like hurricanes and wildfires and the like. And I will have a chapter on that that's a revised, heavily revised and condensed version of an article I published in the California Law Review last year. But this chapter, the one I'm kind of contributing to this conference, is moving the reader to think about climate strains. And by climate strains, I mean other climate impacts that might be more dispersed, longer in duration, might not have the same severity and magnitude of a climate shock, that doesn't necessarily require shutting down of governmental functions or people to temporarily or permanently relocate, but a kind of degradation of daily life. And so in the chapter, and then I'll give you the overview. In the chapter, I kind of define what climate strains are, distinguish them from climate shocks, but also trying to explain that like this is going to impact all of us. It already is. If you think about the wildfire smoke from last summer, the extreme heat in the Southwest and throughout the country, but it's going to disproportionately impact people based on various characteristics: their age, their geographic location, and whether or not they have sufficient resources. And so in the paper, I'm talking about how, low-income folks might not have the resources to retrofit their homes. They might have to work outside of the home. They don't have the luxury of working from home. They might have to work outside. Their kids might go to schools without air conditioning, and they might rely on public transit. So just thinking about kind of climate strains from the perspective of low-income Americans. Then in the paper, I'm talking about, okay, what are the kind of current legal responses to these climate strains? And I talk about subsidies like the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP. If you want to fall asleep sometime very easily, you should check out the Congressional Research Service's publication on the LIHEAP formula, which explains how basically since the 80s, it went to states like Maine and Vermont and Minnesota that needed heating assistance, understandably, in the winter for low-income folks. But the way the block grant is structured, it means that a lot of states spend down all of their funding in that kind of administrative year during the winter months. And then by the summer, they don't have any funding to help people cool their homes. And a lot of states provide heating assistance, but they don't provide cooling assistance. And that's going to be a real problem for us with the climate strains. I talk about investments related to the Inflation Reduction Act. I'll get to that in a second. And also regulation like prohibiting utility disconnections. If you're familiar with Matthew Desmond's book Evicted, about how people in Milwaukee kind of trade off paying rent versus paying their utility bills and facing disconnections and the like. And also OSHA is considering a heat workplace standard, which is going to matter a great deal to the 2+ million farm workers, but also recognizing that like in the state of Florida, where I used to teach, it's unclear that like who will be able to work outside during the growing season in 20 or 25 years. And in the paper, I also talk about like the Amazon warehouse workers and all of the heat related issues so it's not just people who work outside, it's also people who work in airports too, and have to clean planes in between flights. So that's kind of the overview of the paper. 3 things I'm still wrestling with, and I think I'll try and connect them to earlier papers from the day. The first is what I'm calling a decarbonization dilemma, which Chris, I think, anticipates in some ways with his paper on justice trade-offs, which is how can we protect poor people from the ravages of the climate crisis without further exacerbating the climate crisis? One concrete example is the LIHEAP program itself, but I can give you some others if you want. The LIHEAP program is subsidizing people's ability to continue to pay their utility bills, but of course the electrical grid's not green. And so do we pay and subsidize low-income folks to cool their homes when that's encouraging the burning of fossil fuels and contributing to greenhouse gas emissions? The second issue is, even if you get around those normative trade-offs that Chris and others have been talking about, there's still some real design challenges. So the Inflation Reduction Act, the cornerstone of that legislation in many ways are the tax credits for wealthy households and businesses to make these green investments. But of course, most Americans don't itemize their taxes, and most low-income folks don't owe any income tax April 15th. So these tax credits are not really designed to benefit them. Also, low-income folks are more likely are more likely to rent than own their homes. And so they're going to be dependent on landlords' decisions to make these investments, and that's not necessarily a bet I want to make. And then for low-income folks who do own their homes, expecting them to make those kinds of upfront investments, I think, is challenging. The time value of money is particularly acute for them. And then the third and final thing I'm still wrestling with the chapter and the book project more generally, and I'm thinking of Karen's excellent work both for today and earlier, and Joy's as well, is just like a kind of coherent theory about these cooperative federalism programs and the ways in which we rely on federal and state governments to jointly administer and sometimes finance these programs. I mean, Karen's absolutely right that states are trying to maximize revenue and federal dollars and then siphoning it off. But and I've written about that in other work, but we're also seeing a lot of states foregoing federal funding, and I don't really have a good explanation for that other than the kind of ideology and the state level politics. Just to give you a few examples, North Dakota just decided not to participate in the low-income home water assistance program, and given the Supreme Court's decision in 2012 in NFIB v. Sebelius, which rendered the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion optional, there's not much the feds could do about that. 15 states as of December 31st had decided not to participate in really the only public benefit program to come out of the pandemic relief experience, the summer EBT program, which is going to provide food assistance to low-income kids who are going without school meals in the summer months. And then if we want to talk about the pandemic experience, Texas preemptively terminated their expanded unemployment insurance program a year earlier than they had to under federal law. 900,000 Americans in Texas lost their UI benefits. And then if we want to talk about the lack of Medicaid expansion in Texas, Florida, Georgia. So like, how do we think about these programs and the federal control or lack thereof? So I'm very much looking forward to your feedback and the other papers. Thanks.
All right, so my paper is about public banking as an institutional design project or challenge. In recent years, particularly in the wake of first the 2008 financial crisis and then the COVID pandemic, the idea of public banking became quite popular, and many states and municipalities, for example, have embarked on this project of creating those public banks, like California and the city of LA, the city of Philadelphia, although it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere. So there are many reasons, of course, to introduce public banks into the existing financial ecosystem. Some of them obviously have a lot to do with issues of equal access and justice, but there are also important financial stability reasons to create these types of counter-cyclical credit providers. In other words, independent channels of providing fundamental financial services that operate under different logic than, for example, the vast majority or pretty much every financial institution that we have currently, privately owned institutions. So the purpose of this project was to take a look at the current debate, the state of debate on public banking, and clarify certain terms, because there is quite a bit of confusion with respect to what a public bank is, what it is supposed to do, can it do things, and so forth. And the second goal was to expand the boundaries of that debate, take it to a systemic level, because it seems that a lot of that debate kind of walks, or people debating this idea are walking within the same kind of circle. And that makes it much more difficult to see the real problems and potential solutions in the longer term. So I adopt an institutional design approach to this particular project. And this paper does three things. First, I try to identify the key functions that a public bank is supposed to perform. The second thing is I try to identify and discuss institutional design challenges, the specific trade-offs and tensions and potential compromises that arise in the process of some policymakers or activists trying to create a particular type of a public bank that serves a particular purpose, performs a particular function or a set of those functions. And the third thing is locating this public banking project in the broader context of debates that are currently not associated directly with the public banking debates. And those are the debates on the future of finance, future of central banking, future of digital money, and so on and so forth. Because to me, this is the actual linkage to the broader context, the broader political economy struggles that public banking efforts and campaigns really need to be a part of. So quickly, the key functions of a public bank. What is a public bank? And it's kind of funny that people basically lump together three different functions that a public bank is supposed to perform. One is provide free universal deposit services, essentially bank the unbanked, provide this kind of, basic access to transactional plumbing of the financial system, right? And we've seen in COVID, during the COVID pandemic, how important that access can be. The second function is to extend affordable credit, for example, to individuals and households and businesses that are currently locked out of the credit system because they're considered too risky, primarily because they are not within the certain socioeconomic or income bracket, right? And the third function is to provide sustainable public investment in various infrastructures within communities, not only physical infrastructures, but very importantly, social infrastructures, care infrastructures, and so on and so forth. And frequently, when people talk excitedly about the public bank, right, they basically say, well, why not have, for example, the state of Massachusetts, right, take the money that it currently parks somewhere at JP Morgan or Citibank and have those deposits sit at the public bank, and then public bank can take those deposits, take that money and invest it in great social care infrastructure and fix the roads and also lend to people who currently cannot access credit and do all of these other wonderful things. So what are the challenges if we take seriously those three functions, right? What are the challenges in terms of designing an actual bank? Because when you call some institution a bank, then immediately you're bringing in a particular set of assumptions about what that business model will look like. In effect, explicitly or implicitly, what you're doing here is that you're working off of the traditional bank model, business model of a private bank, the balance sheet of a private bank, right? What's on the asset side, what's on the liability side. And based on that, you're sort of projecting that a public bank that is not going to be owned by private shareholders, that is not going to try to maximize the profits of those private shareholders, that will have this public mandate to use the deposit money or deposit funding, for example, to channel it into various publicly necessary credit channels or, investments and so on and so forth. That's all that it takes, right? And then it's only a matter of how much money this public bank will get from the legislature, for example, right? But it's interesting once you start mapping out what the process of designing a particular balance sheet or a particular business model for a public bank is, right? The map actually, at least in my mind, comes to three pivotal decision points. First, how are you going to finance it? The second is how is this bank going to invest the money wherever it gets it and however much it gets. And the third one is, of course, governance, which takes on a heightened significance when we're talking about the public bank, because it's a very different kind of an animal in the current banking system. And it's interesting because, what I started doing is like, I was kind of saying, okay, let's take at face value, right? What is the primary purpose of creating this particular public bank, for example? Is it to bank the unbanked and give them free, universally accessible deposit? Is it to provide low-cost, affordable credit to individuals or maybe to minority-owned businesses or businesses in disadvantaged communities? Or what is it? Is it about deposit taking? Is it about credit provision? Or is it actually about investment? In other words, rebuilding those, energy networks and doing what Andrew has been talking about, right? So if you take a function and then you sort of start unwrapping what kind of choices that function to be performed successfully presents in terms of how to fund it, how exactly to choose the specific projects in which to channel the money that this particular public bank has in light of this particular mandate, and what kind of governance problems it raises, suddenly you actually start really crystallizing the types of trade-offs and inevitable compromises that the creators of that public bank, whatever it is, would face. For example, I'm just going to give you a few examples, right? For example, it is actually inherently difficult to combine deposit taking, particularly the kind of deposit taking that is meant to be a public service, banking the unbanked or providing free, affordable services to anyone who walks through the door, like a public utility kind of thing, right, is left here, with the affordable credit function, because those two functions implicate the opposite side of the balance sheet of the same institution. And the interesting thing about both deposits and the loans, even when you look at a private bank's balance sheet, is that the deposits are hybrid things. They are simultaneously a source of funding for the bank, and also the actual product, the service, the inventory that that bank creates for the economy. Same with loans. The loans are a source of investing, source of revenue for the private bank, right? At the same time, from the macro perspective, the loans that banks extend into the economy are the product. That's the reason why we actually have banks manufacturing these products. So in the context of a private bank, right, to the private bank, all they care about is the funding function of deposits and the revenue function of the loans. That's all they care about, because their motivation is, you know, you borrow, you take deposits, you pay very little interest on that, and then you lend money, you extend loans, and you charge high interest on it. And basically that's how you make your money. And that's their goal. This is the easiest way of balancing this inherently fragile business model. Plus, of course, the government steps in, provides FDIC insurance and all of these other things. But for a public bank, it's the other side of both deposits and loans that matters more. In other words, deposits for a public bank is not primarily how they're going to cheaply fund themselves, right? This is about providing that service that private banks do not provide to the people who cannot and should not be paying an arm and leg for access to these services. Similarly with loans, it's not about revenues per se. It is about providing that access to economic opportunity that the private banking system doesn't provide. However, nevertheless, you do not take away the need for the public bank to worry about how am I going to fund my low-cost, high-risk loans, because those affordable loans are inherently high risk. Not only that, they're inherently going to be considered mispriced or incorrectly priced loans. If you're charging very low interest rate for the kind of a loan that you're extending to people with low income or low asset base, right? Then every economist out there that is educated in a venerable institution such as Yale University will tell you this is basically by design a mispriced asset. And so this is where that kind of direct translation of the private bank's business model onto a public bank simply falls apart, right? And bond financing, frequently it says, particularly if you're thinking about the public bank as an industrial policy, kind of an investment institution rather than deposit-taking institution, right? Then frequently the answer is, well, then, you know, let's make sure that the government gives some chunk of money to this public bank, and then public bank takes a chunk of money and goes into the bond market and borrows in the bond market, and then uses that leverage to basically invest into green energy or care or whatever it is, right? And the problem with bond financing is that if you borrow from private bondholders, you become basically beholden to those private bondholders' demand for the interest payments of whatever you promised on time. And that means that the asset side of this public bank's portfolio, because they chose to finance their investments through the bond market, the asset side is extremely inherently limited in terms of channeling investments precisely in the types of projects that would require the patient public capital. So what does that mean? These tensions and trade-offs, I'm not the first to figure them out. I'm sure that every public bank advocate and people who are working on these projects, they're very well aware of all these limitations. And there are viable models of a public bank at the state level or on a municipal level. Like, for example, Bank of North Dakota. Apparently, that's the state that refuses to, alleviate climate strains, although it has this beautiful 100-some years old public bank that is extremely well regarded, right? So you can take deposits, but for example, the Bank of North Dakota makes those deposits just on purpose extremely unattractive, so that nobody actually comes through the door and opens a deposit account at the Bank of North Dakota, because the Bank of North Dakota focuses its efforts on the lending side. And even on the lending side, they do not lend directly. They lend directly some, but most of their lending is done through private banks, community banks that are local to North Dakota. And so the Bank of North Dakota basically doesn't want to aggravate those private banks by competing for deposits with them, right? Because that's the source of funding for private banks. Yes, this is how that model works. So if you want to replicate that type of a model, let's say in Massachusetts, there is no guarantee it will be replicated, but at least it's a viable vision. However, from the point of view of what the public bank really is designed, or we're hoping it would achieve, right? This is a compromise. So the more interesting question about these tensions and conflicts is why? Why do we encounter these tensions and conflicts? And my answer is that that's because each individual standalone state level or municipal level public bank is essentially designed to be or meant to be an institution that is dropped inside a much bigger financial system that operates on private profit driven motivation and otherwise remains intact. So it becomes this one addition to the system, and the hope is that somehow there will be an alignment. So this public bank will fill the gaps, remember the market failure language and all of that stuff, right? And will provide all these wonderful public outcomes. And basically, but nevertheless, the implicit assumption goes, will operate on the same principles as the rest of the private financial system operates. But that conflict, that is a systemic conflict, because a public bank is a qualitatively different paradigm. And that paradigm creates that conflict with its host system. And it's that public bank that from the beginning is forced to internalize that systemic conflict. And that's why it must compromise basically on its policy footprint, on its ability to achieve its goals. So my answer to that is, all right, so what do we do? Yes, we absolutely should pursue these public banking projects, fully understanding and accepting the trade-offs to the extent we can accept them, right? Because this is an important, each one public bank that is successfully established is an important step toward proving the concept in general, that the state actually can be a market participant in the financial system, right? But what really needs to be done in order to maximize the full potential of public banking, both as a tool of economic justice and political justice, and as a tool of financial stability, is to basically re-envision it as an ecosystem, as a public ecosystem of public finance. And when you think about that ecosystem, right, you cannot escape the one actor that has to be at the center of that ecosystem, and that's central bank. That's the Fed. Because it's the Fed that is the one public bank that doesn't have liquidity constraints on the deposit side, on the money creation side of its balance sheet. And that should actually utilize the new technology that enables it now to break down all of this nonsense with relying on private intermediary banks to provide those type of sovereign money access and deposit services to people, and offer those deposit accounts directly to everybody free of charge. Unlike state or municipal level public banks, the central bank is not going to be strapped in its capacity then to fund on the asset side, for example, the lending and the public investment that can be done not by the central bank directly, but a wide variety of public institutions at state levels, at municipal levels, including new public banks and green banks, and maybe Bank of North Dakota could also get some money from the Fed to do all of that climate stuff. But also bring in the private institutions of new kinds, right? Co-ops and various other mutually owned financial institutions and whatnot that are willing to work as part of this public finance ecosystem toward public interest goals. And this is my hope, that at some point, the public banking advocates will be able to see the sort of the importance of supplementing their current efforts that are focused on the individual institutional design within their own ambit with this broader focus on how the central bank really should be redesigned as a truly public bank.
Great. So this is a paper on how to get stuff built. Thanks to Raj Bhargava, as well as others not in the room, for excellent research assistant helping with the paper. It's motivated largely by the need to make a green transition to clean energy production. I think that it's fairly obvious to many of us that we build far too expensively and far too slowly to come close to meeting our climate goals. which is going to help doom us to future climate disasters. Of course, though, building slowly and expensively is a problem for lots of things. People need transportation to get to work. If you can't build the transit, they're not going to be able to get to work, and they're going to have lower economic mobility. So what I talk about here in the context of the permitting of physical infrastructure are two things. So first, how do we get here? And second, where do we go from here? So turning to the first question, how do we get here? There's a deep political history going back to arguably the founding of the country, where we were fighting a distant despotic king. We've long not liked centralized authority. We've long opted for decentralization and lots of checks and balances. It's also a more recent political history in the late 60s, early 70s, at a time of particularly heightened distrust of the state, given Vietnam, the awareness about our failures to protect the environment. In that context, both deep and then in the 60s, 70s, we passed the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, to protect the environment. It set up a regime of permitting new projects, along with a subsequent overlay of judicial doctrine that is accreted over many decades, that many people believe has made building infrastructure slow and expensive. Of course, there are many other things that passed around the same time, and lots of things are going on at the same time. So I don't want to pick on NEPA too much, but I think it's emblematic of the things I want to talk about. So what's the current regime? So any major federal action, including funding for a project, requires environmental review subject to NEPA. This results in a document which are on average 450 pages for projects that are expected to have significant environmental effects and take on average 4.5 years to write, that lay out the impacts and discuss alternatives. NEPA does not actually impose any substantive requirements on agencies, but given the, I think, arguably fairly lax standards for standing and the strict procedural requirements arguably imposed by courts, projects often end up tied up in litigation for many years after the 4.5 years of the environmental review, for say, not considering one thing in the environmental review to caricature it to some extent. And on top of this, we have fairly weak capacity to plan in a variety of ways. We have far too few permitters, which is part of what slows things down. We have too few tools to promote good public participation, and then few tools to kind of plan for the vision that we want for the country. Similar issues are going on at the state and local level. There's also a state and local overlay that's also very important for permitting many projects, in particular lots of wind and solar energy. In international comparison, the US is arguably quite different, at least if you trust literature by political scientists like Robert Kagan, which I'm inclined to do. The US is quite unusual in its degree of litigiousness and procedure boundedness. Other countries, in contrast, tend to rely more on negotiated political solutions or deference to expert bureaucracies rather than long litigation through the courts. So what have the effects of this been? So look, it's hard to say. We don't have great evidence here. Lots of things are happening at the same time, but let me gesture toward a few things that we do know. So one, on costs, it is certainly plausible to think that NEPA and the associated reforms substantially, possibly dramatically increase the cost of building infrastructure. I have a paper on the cost of building the interstate highways. If you look at the cost of building in the 1980s versus the 1960s, the cost of building a mile of interstate highway tripled between that time, and the increase started basically when NEPA passed. It's not like it costs more to hire labor. It's not cost. Construction workers have not gotten richer over this period of time. Instead, we're building more stuff, probably more expensive routes, more expensive structures, sound walls, building parks above highways, building below ground, all things that are great in the abstract, but cost quite a bit. And what you might want to do if you're either afraid of litigation ex ante or to end the litigation during the course of it. In international context, the U.S. also has some of the highest construction costs in the world. If you look at urban transit, so subways and rail within cities, the US is 3 times as high as the average rich or medium income country. We're 6 times as high as countries like Spain and Portugal. For highways, international context, based on fairly limited data, the available data on US projects are several times more expensive than any highway project that I could find in other countries. So I don't want to lay this all up to permitting, that would be absurd, but it's plausible to think that this is part of what's going on. So that's one thing, costs. 2, public participation. Part of the goal here is that we would encourage public participation, at least via litigation. And it seems undeniably the case, at least in the case of case studies, that like the horrible things that we did in the 50s and 60s, bulldozing poor neighborhoods, we didn't stop doing, but we did less of that after these reforms. At the same time, if you look at the data, if you look at those highways, like who actually got more money after the passage of NEPA? Rich communities. There was actually no difference in spending between rich and poor places before NEPA. There was a huge difference, 3x difference after NEPA. Plausible stories there is that who's better at using the courts? It's going to be rich people, tend to be, not poor people. It's hard. It can be hard to access. So third dimension, environmental benefits. Again, not so easy to say. Certainly, it's the case. The U.S. the environment in the U.S. has gotten vastly better than it was in the 60s. Much better, much cleaner air, much cleaner water. Does NEPA have much to do with that? Not for clean air, but it's possible. I was struck by the fact that I was able to. It's hard to find much data on this, but I was able to find data on the mileage of natural gas pipelines in the country, and like if you look before and after NEPA, it just like keeps on going up straight. Might have gone up even more, but it's not like we like thwarted those things, despite the many high-profile battles where NEPA did slow things down and perhaps even stop them. So my read is that there are a variety of beliefs consistent with this evidence, but one plausible read is that our regime has dramatically slowed things down and increased costs a lot, and it's questionable whether this is even the best way to promote participation and protect the environment. Europe, for example, which does not have this regime, is not an environmental hellscape, for example. So let me turn to the second question. Where do we go from here? How do we get stuff built at reasonable cost, have good environmental outcomes, and ensure good public participation? So I divide these reforms into 2 possible spectrums. First, we can increase the power of the executive to decide, especially the federal executive, and especially vis-a-vis courts. And second, we can increase the capacity of the executive branch to plan. And I think these are 2 complementary approaches. Government that does a better job planning, including better, more broad public participation, is plausibly better equipped to wield power. There are many potential reforms. I don't adjudicate between them. I won't go through them all here. But let me highlight several different types of approaches. So first, on the power dimension, a lot of these possibilities have to do with limiting the power of the judiciary. You could change the standard of review so that, if the agency would have had to not consider something that would have likely changed the outcome of the project, rather than just forgetting something that may not have done that. Many people think that stopping injunctions could be big. Like the agency forgets to doesn't mention one thing that the judge thinks they should mention, and you stop the whole thing. But you don't have to have an injunction. Instead, you could say have ex post damages after the fact. If you end up causing damage, you pay for that harm rather than the injunction. A kind of more radical or bigger change relative to our political institutions would be binding negotiation. So kind of a corporatist approach like European countries also often have in the context of labor. You get representatives of the various parties in the room, they make an agreement, and then it's harder to litigate that in the aftermath. You could use legislatures or elections. A state could have a referendum and say, do we want to do it, not want to do it, and then make that binding, kind of restrict litigation after that. And more generally, you could have more federal preemption to reduce the state and local aspects of this. So that's dimension one on power. Second dimension on planning. So, just basically, the first thing is just could hire more staff and better staff, just kind of build better state capacity in a way that, we've been eroding for since at least the 80s. We could collect better data, which is in many cases astonishingly poor now. Having spent quite a while trying to see what's out there, it's really very bad. So it'd be helpful to know what's on the ground. It's not rocket science to have this data. We should have it. We could do more programmatic reviews. So say, here's a large area, we can build solar here, do good participatory planning, rather than kind of doing piece by piece, each of which ends up being litigated. And then, we could have more broad, like Spiel mentioned earlier, early in public participation. Simple example is just soliciting more information from a broad set of impacted parties, especially those who are less likely to participate, kind of disadvantaged parties. A more radical example would be kind of participatory decision-making, like the ancient Greeks did, and like some folks are doing now across the world. You could choose representatives by lot, inform them with experts, they discuss, say what they wish, and then decision makers could take that into account in a binding or perhaps non-binding way. So there are a lot of possibilities, but what they have in common is seeking ways other than litigation to achieve good participation and good policy outcomes. And I can hope that we can at least begin to experiment with alternatives. So to wrap up, I'm kind of hopeful about change here, because I don't think there's much reason to think that we're at a point that's kind of the best negotiated place between our two political parties. It's unlikely that this is what was intended in the first place. Well over 4 years to complete an environmental review. I think this is not what it was, at least in the early 70s, after the thing was passed. At the same time, there are hard conceptual questions here. What kind of participation do we want? How much do we care about centralized authority? How much can we trust the executive to act in good faith, especially when these polarized times when Donald Trump might be in charge soon enough. At the same time, I fear that at least the U.S. role in deciding the future of the planet is going to hinge on figuring this out. So I really hope that we do.
That was really wonderful. Thank you for these excellent, interesting papers. So since we're the final panel of the day and we have a large panel, I'm going to try to keep my remarks relatively short and leave time for questions. So these were 4 papers on 4 really different subjects, and I want to do a little bit to try to connect them. The theme I want to focus on is the relationship between democracy and the public on the one hand, and capacity and effective government on the other. Speaking very generally, Amy and Joel's paper and Solly's paper put problems of democracy and publicness at the center, foregrounded those problems, while Andrew and Zach, I think, focused more on capacity and the power of government to do its job well, to provide critical services and infrastructure in a timely way. Obviously, that's overly simplistic, and all the papers are doing both, but at a kind of a high level of generality. Also want to say by way of introduction that I really appreciate that all of these papers do an admirable job of tackling these problems, not just at a theoretical level, but also with real granularity, with lots of empirical rich data. So we really learn how permitting works, how the social welfare system works, how banking works, and how industrial policy happens or could happen on the ground. And so in that way, also, I think the papers form a really terrific group. They teach us about concrete contexts, but also tee up this core problem of the relationship between state capacity and democracy. So I think one thing is that we can have there's a recognition that democracy requires capacity and power, right? They're not totally separate. But conversely, that capacity and power are only valuable or desirable if they're exercised in ways that are democratic. To your point about, imagining future administrations. A second recurring theme from the papers, and I think from the conference that came up quite a bit in the last panel, is that formal mechanisms for democracy or for participation do not necessarily offer a sufficient conception of democracy, particularly when they occur without actual power or without a public mission or without concern for material distribution. So just the right of participation is not sufficient. I think the authors challenge us to rethink what it means to have democratic administration with capacity, that it might mean focusing less on procedure, or at least focusing less exclusively on procedural rights, and more on substance and equality and power. So my first question for all the panelists to think about is to reflect on those two issues. First, the relationship between capacity and democracy, and how both can be furthered, or to what extent those are in tension with one another. And second, what it means to reject a formalistic or purely proceduralist approach to democracy. But I also want to say a bit about each paper and offer a few more specific questions. So I'll go backwards here. Zach argues that we need to reform the U.S. permitting regime in order to build public infrastructure at a reasonable or even fast, right, pace and cost without undue harms to communities or to the environment. And he characterizes the current regime as involving limited executive branch power, especially as compared to the judiciary's power, and limited executive branch capacity, especially with regard to planning. And so we really get the sense about how lengthy environmental review is, and the sense that the procedures and the litigation are crushing. Although you don't say so explicitly, the image the reader gets, or at least this reader, is one of democracy as a drag, right? Public engagement as a problem, as a source of delay, at least as it's currently constructed, right? So on this account, public participation, at least as it's currently designed, allows for citizen voice, primarily in the form of litigation, but it's at odds with efficacy and power and capacity to solve the public's problems. And then, despite all the opportunities for review and public engagement, you tell us that the current planning process doesn't actually empower representative groups, and especially neglects low-income people. So on the one hand, we have all this participation, but not actual power or democracy in the system. So one question that poses for me is whether you mean to suggest an inherent and inevitable tension between democracy or forms of participation and capacity, or is that only a tension because of the way the process is currently designed? So as you think about reforms, and actually you touched on this a bit, but how might the public be more of a source of capacity and power rather than a drag? How can we reimagine planning so that government has more capacity to plan better and more discretion to build, but in a way that really satisfies a robust conception of democracy that doesn't leave that power arbitrary or unchecked? And what might that look like? Andrew gives us a chapter of what promises to be a really terrific book that wrestles with the problem of climate and social welfare. And he details the extent to which the federal government lacks capacity to support low-income households in dealing with climate strains, which is a really great, not an idea that I was familiar with before, but the distinction between climate strains and climate shocks, and really illustrates that well, and urges that new approaches must be developed. But as with Zach's paper, I think Andrew's focused primarily on capacity to meet the needs of citizens to address these key challenges facing our country. And democracy figures even more implicitly here, but I do think it does figure, right? Insofar as a democratic government must be able to meet the needs of its people. So I would love to hear you reflect about what role democracy and the public play in your account. Is there a lurking argument that democracy has a material element as well as a procedural element? Does your close analysis of the social welfare failures of the current administration help us get purchase on some substantive or material component of democracy? And also, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the part of the book that we don't have about reforms, right? So we have a brief list of possible reforms at the end of the chapter, but not a full sense of what you're thinking. And one might wonder whether the ones that you've kind of sketched out briefly are adequate to meet the challenges that you detail. And whether there are ways that your reforms might create a form of administration that not only better enables the government to meet urgent needs in light of climate change, but does so in a way that is democratic and that builds both capacity and democracy going forward. So it kind of changes the political economy such that, for example, fewer states might opt out in the future of spending programs like the ones you highlighted. Okay, now turning to banking, we have a fascinating paper that complicates what it means for something to be public. You argue in favor of making banking a public business in good times as well as bad, in order to guarantee the flow of money and credit and to enable public investment. And you're also emphasizing the need to scale up capacity, but I love also the phrase in your paper about scaling up public ambition, right? So it's not just about scaling up government's capacity, but scaling up our expectations of government. But your focus really, I don't think, is actually exclusively or even primarily on capacity, but rather on the public nature of that capacity, on publicness. And you encourage us to think more deeply about what public means, and not to treat it just as about government ownership, which I found really helpful. At the same time, you're not making an unbounded argument for public control. You're recognizing the need to balance democratic control with technocratic management. And I think, urging the balance between democratic control and technocracy is easy at a theoretical level, but much harder to figure out how to do it on the ground. And you try to do that, right? You offer us a contextualized, grounded analysis of how to balance those competing concerns. So one question that emerges then is whether there are lessons to generalize beyond the banking context about this difficult issue of how to balance democracy with technical control and with capacity, or is that effort to balance those sometimes competing demands inevitably a question that is contextual and fact-bound? And then second, throughout the paper, there are calls to democratize the economy. And I wanted to invite you to say more about the connection, about kind of what that means, and about the connection between the public and the democratic, and in particular, who the public is in your conception, or who the publics are, and whether democratizing the economy requires more organization than we have now, and what kinds of organization that might look like in the banking context. Okay, and then finally, turning to Amy and Joel's paper, their paper, as we know, defines industrial policy as the deliberate attempt to shape different sectors of the economy to meet public aims. So again, we have the emphasis on the public. And you argue that whatever one thinks about the nature of democracy today, it requires both greater state capacity, or it requires greater state capacity to achieve public goals for the economy, and a greater degree of material equality and organized power for marginalized groups. And the goal is to ensure that state power is in fact exercised in the broad interest or in the public interest. So I think the framework actually does really pull together those different strands that I started with, right? So on your account, democracy is not just about participation in process. It has a substantive component. It requires state capacity, and it requires a level of, to meet public ends and material redistribution or equality. And it has a process component, but one that's distinct from the administrative state as it's now structured, the kind of fetishization of process, as Nick Bagley has critiqued, or as you critique with your quite persuasive data about the permitting process. So as you know, I'm persuaded by the project. I've already discussed it with you, but I wanted to press you a little bit about the back end of the paper, including like the political economy of your proposals. The paper has a lot about Congress should do X, Congress should do Y, many of which are about empowering labor unions, and so I'm all for them. But they could be criticized for being at once like small bore and impossible. So, in some sense, that's a very predictable question. Anything arguing kind of good reforms at this point in our world is potentially impossible, at least from Congress. But I wanted to invite you to say a bit more about kind of what where Solly closed in terms of like how to build the ecosystem that makes the future changes possible. I'll leave it there.
Try to respond. Okay.
Maybe we'll take brief responses and then go to the audience.
Yeah, so I definitely think that, or at least I do mean to suggest that litigation is the drag, but litigation, democracy is not equal to litigation. I think it's pretty plausible to think that they're not even correlated positively in this case. So I think that it is plausible to think that we're in a bad enough place now that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have more participation by doing it better. I think, like Sabila said earlier in the process, with outreach, rather than depending upon this back-end litigation, which there's just very little reason to think it actually does succeed in promoting useful participatory or democratic ends. So I'm optimistic about it. At the same time, like there are lots of proposals out there that would just cut out the litigation and then just like in there And that would reduce participation and at least by some people, and that could probably be bad. But I don't think that the earlier planning like needs to be super duper expensive. Like these things cost billions of dollars. Spending even $100,000, which is a lot of money, on some outreach is a drop in the bucket in terms of the overall cost, but could have a lot of impact on really achieving participatory and democratic ends.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kate. So just a couple things, because I want to let other folks talk, and I'm interested in other questions too, is I do think the climate crisis will continue to kind of scramble politics, both on the appropriation side for disasters, but also internal displacement and pressures as people move across borders. And there are debates in Congress about letting people use their Medicaid health insurance in a different state if they have to relocate because of a disaster. I also just want to point out that we have to have a very inclusive understanding of social citizenship, or even just a right to social assistance, to even capture the number of low-income folks in the United States. So my remarks seem to suggest it's just federal and state, but when you want to start talking about DC and the 5 territories and indigenous folks, 500 plus federally recognized tribes. So we need to think about the territories and tribes which are actually on the front lines on the climate crisis. And then even if we focus on US citizens, there's a whole host of laws we need to scrap and rethink when it comes to immigrant eligibility for public benefits. I mean, we've basically been in a period for the last 20 years of disenrolling immigrant families from health insurance and food assistance and cash assistance and disability assistance, you name it. And so, and yet 1 in 4 kids in the United States have at least 1 foreign-born parent, and 1 in 3 low-income kids have at least 1 foreign-born parent. And in a country of birthright citizenship, that means we have a lot of citizen kids who are being denied basic assistance, in part because of all of these challenges around serving mixed status families. So I guess I'm very interested in a capacious understanding of whose needs get determined, whose needs are considered in the kind of broader cooperative federalism framework.
Well, thank you so much, Kate, for these wonderful comments. And of course, these are extremely complicated questions you're raising. If I could just quickly summarize to you how capacity relates to democracy, I would be so proud of myself. But I'm the first to admit that, yes, my work focuses primarily on capacity, because I see understanding how to build specific type of institutional capacity, particularly with respect to banking, that is the sector in which we create money, which is a universal input into absolutely every economic activity and into every exchange, period. It is sort of the basis for the rights to economic participation, but also to participation in social life, right? So to the extent that this is itself kind of fundamentally an instrument of democracy, then understanding what kind of institutional structure, market structure, or structure of individual firms, or whatever it is, the government's engagement with those firms and those markets, we need in order to maximize and not constantly sort of chip away at that capacity, or at that ability of the money, of the sovereign money and public finance, to basically perform that function as an important ingredient, or the fuel for democratic engagement. Otherwise, I think that's very important. I don't know. I'm always torn between thinking that banking, of course, is special. It's very hard to generalize from banking, and the sentiment that, yeah, it's special, but not quite that unique, right? There are a variety of activities and markets out there where one could at least sort of on a meta level apply that same type of institutional focus approach. The second question, democratizing, what does it mean? So to me, again, democratizing is not just about sort of, what is democracy? Is it the process for input in decision making, or is it the sort of the the orientation of decision makings in terms of whose needs the decisions serve. Or so to me, democratizing the financial system is more kind of immediately about creating structural incentives to prioritize the things like systemic stability, allocation of credit and financial resources to productive economic activities that are likely to generate more fair sort of development across the country and across different social classes or groups, that is sustainable environmentally, that is resilient, and so on and so forth. So without kind of diminishing the value of thinking about the procedures for input, like do we need, for example, do we need central bank to hold town halls in various regions of the country, for example, talking to people, how does our policy affect you, right? Perhaps we do. But my work is about this sort of, how do we redefine the way the banking system works or the financial system works, so that we can change the structure of the economy, so that that new resilient economy actually can be the basis or the core, or one of the driving agents of a resilient democracy. So this is where I come in.
Thanks, Kate, for these great questions. I think working backwards from the political economy constraints is precisely the right way to think about it. And to a certain extent, we're already sort of locked in that intellectual framework. I mean, we often in the paper, we talk about industrial policy primarily in terms of subsidy of outputs, because that's where the policy debate has centered recently. But that's not by any means the only way to do industrial policy. You can do industrial policy by network building, or by subsidizing labor training in a particular sector, or through trade policy, or a huge variety of other means. But the political economy constraints are the precise reason that subsidy of outputs has been such an attractive tool for legislators, because it avoids both congressional rules that make non-spending regulatory bills difficult, and it also creates an embedded set of constituencies who are interested in pushing legislation past the finish line. So I think figuring out how to attach conditionality to that subsidy to empower folks who are not necessarily the primary recipients, who are not driving the policy process, but that can use that as a lever to gain hold eventually, is a key way to achieve some of the ends we talk about in the paper. And I think the other feature of this is thinking about how to create durable policy feedback loops for industrial policy programs, and figure out how to ensure the right groups are part of it. One sort of example we briefly talk about in the paper, starting in the 1990s, I believe, there were 2 National Institute of Standards and Technology programs, or at least 2, that were focused on supporting like small and medium-sized manufacturing firms. One's the Manufacturing Externship Program, the other national, I can't remember the other name. The latter one, the reason I can't recall its name is it died a death in the Bush II administration. It was defunded in part because it funded only a small number of firms, whereas the Manufacturing Extension Program extended its tentacles across all 50 states and a variety of congressional districts, and created a policy lock-in that resulted in a diverse group of people who were interested in its continuation. So those kinds of dynamics, I think, are inherent to industrial policy. The question is, how do you empower through them groups that would otherwise not have a role in decision making, so that they can play a role in determining where programs go in the future.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just add to that. I mean, we use another example in the paper. So a lot of the paper is organized around this current moment and thinking. I mean, there's a lot of discretion. There's huge billions, tens of billions of dollars flowing, and there are questions things that you can do with respect to design of conditionalities and so forth. And we ought to be thinking in this feedback loop sense. But the paper also offers another example, which connects up to Karen Tani's paper earlier about nursing homes, which is the home care example. And I know one you know well, Kate, too, which is to say, like, part of the reason we're offering this framework of, it's like focusing on countervailing power and public power, or sort of administrative power together, is that we think that broadly, also in the design of programs, that if you don't think this way, you won't be able to get the programs that we actually want, that sort of operate in a way that reflects how unequal our democracy has been, and to make it more democratic. And so in the home care context, for example, like, I think you can see easily how one could sort of try to expand healthcare just by empowering bureaucrats and imagining you're going to pass some statute and there goes healthcare and this is going to be great. Or you could think about it much more from the bottom up, and that we don't have home care in part for reasons, which is to do with the fact that like the burdens are imposed on women and people of color who could now have to do either all this care privately or not paid at all or poorly paid. And so if you want to actually fundamentally change a system such that you expand Medicare, Medicaid to build home care, you need to think about empowering those constituencies, both people who are getting care and people who are providing care. Can you empower them together in such a way that over time they build power and demand more provision of those services, making the services better, and actually also building the kind of feedback loops that you need to actually imagine the expansion of those services being good for people. And so I think thinking back to the sort of, nursing homes, like you can get nursing homes. What you can't get is good nursing homes. And so the whole point is like, we need to think differently about what it would mean to achieve the good thing in this context. And not only a sort of, we need nursing homes. Let's try to design, this, through expert, consultation and bureaucracy, but actually by thinking in this more power building way. So, which is to say, I guess we are trying to provide some more ambitious conceptual map to think about the connection between democracy and expertise and sort of centralized power of government. I think very broadly speaking, we see like we ought to think about democracy. So democracy is a system of politics based on the equality of people. Democracy is also a way that we organize our world to achieve things, right? And so we're trying to draw on these different traditions to say you absolutely need capacity and expertise, and you need to imagine that this system actually achieves equality of persons and is fed by equality of persons. I'm thinking back to Blake's point earlier that like in this world that is not been, if you place a neutral procedure on top of the history we have, that is not going to produce decisions or institutions or the exercise of this power in a way that's democratic. And so you have to sort of think in power-based terms about how to actually intervene to make it more democratic at the same time as you're trying to build that power. And so this is where these two kind of concepts of sort of administrative power and countervailing power to us, which can be in tension with one another, but then together would become something like public power, democratic power more broadly.
Thank you.
So
We can just go to you for your question. Yeah. Chris.
But I want to put your paper in conversation with this paper that we're talking about tomorrow on transcendent monism. And I want to do that in EVA, right? So when environmental justice advocates were first making distribution-based claims, they were trying to do it through substance means. Like they tried through the equal protection clause, they tried through a couple civil rights provisions, and the court shut the door on them on substance. So now you have both wealthy people and low-income people making procedural claims, but for very different reasons, right? One on substantive slowing down concerns, others through indirectly channeling their substance. So the rich are making procedural claims to slow them down. The low-income are making procedural claims in lieu of substantive claims. So, so that gave me thinking, like, if you're shutting down ex post to everyone, right, both the wealthy and the low income, then everything in terms of equity really hinges on the participation part. That's really like the last paragraph of the paper, right? In the sense that if you're shutting off the back end door, right, then the only avenue then for the low income people to be able to access the permitting system through procedure or substance is going to be the participatory function in the beginning. And I'm wondering, normatively, is pure ex-ante procedure enough to get those claims through? I don't know, I'm just worried on shutting the door on the back end to both low income and wealthy people using NEPA might create some side effects if we're not, assuming ex-ante the current state of substantive constitutional civil rights.
So I think these are all great concerns, and I think that those who really want to, hack away at the ability to sue are, probably not fully owning up to the costs of doing that. So I think we should recognize, like, there are costs. but there also are benefits. We want to weigh those costs and benefits, especially need to make a rapid green transition. I want to push back though on the idea that kind of everything equity related would then rely on front-end participation, because there are, lots of means for goals of equity to make it in, including the political process. We elected a president and he appoints people, and many countries rely on that, as well as bureaucrats and appointees who have public hearings and are confronted by the media and by groups disadvantaged and otherwise. So yes, you need to rely on things other than litigation, but I think almost all other countries do that, and more than we do. And in a cross-country, the cross-country evidence, I think, suggests that leads me to believe that it's worth cutting back some. Not shutting the door. Nowhere in the paper may suggest shutting the door, but the benefits of building more quickly, building more cheaply would justify some of the costs, given these other avenues seem feasible elsewhere.
So I found that distinction between the dimension of increasing executive decision power and the planning capacity to be really interesting and important, and maybe a cross feed for this great panel. Because it seems like planning capacity is something distinctive that is different from like organization capacity, communication capacity, and it's sort of that's a generic tool that you might need if you're trying to think about welfare or perspective, like how do you stop this suite of benefits from this angle. You're trying to think about like what choices banking is making on the credit and debit side of the ledger. If you're thinking about this kind of power in any domain, having some kind of special administrative capacity to think holistically about a problem and then take a set of program steps and maybe iteratively take feedback seems like a special sort of government power. And so I guess I'm curious, like what that is. Like do we have that already, or do we not have it? Because how many years? In some parts of your paper, it's not like we don't have it, but then like some of the data you were relying on suggests maybe we do have really high capacity of a certain sort. And so like obviously we're very good at like cutting checks, it seems, during the pandemic. Like we did a lot of that, and like it seems like Treasury and IRS like have a lot of capacity at that, but like maybe not for like let's think holistically about reallocating power in a discretionary way. So anyway, what is planning?
Yeah, so if you look at the data, and political scientists rate us as having pretty good state capacity. Like, look, we're the richest big country in the world. Decades of conservative attempts to cut back the state can only do so much. But state capacity is different from participatory capacity, and like there's not good data on this. This is anecdotal. My sense from reading and also from being in government is it's not that good. You kind of in some obscure way say we're planning on doing something, spend 4.5 years largely behind closed doors writing environmental impact review, and then depend on the litigation and on the back end to kind of mobilize people, and they kind of want to flip it. We want the engagement on the front end, and hopefully this would result in something that is cheaper, better, more participatory. So that's my hope, but seems feasible. But there's not great data on this. I wish there were That's my sense.
Andrew.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on this, not to pick a fight with Zach, who I adore, but I think that, or with you, Blake, who I also adore, but I'm not super excited about expanding executive capacity or executive planning and decision-making full stop. I have a paper with Ariel Giroux, Kleiman, and Gabe Scheffler that I think Georgetown said they were going to publish like last year, but it's still not on their website yet. But we're actually thinking about ways to like automate some anti-poverty legislation. So regular benefit increases, not relying on state governors or legislatures for asking for like technical waivers on time limits for quote unquote able-bodied adults without dependents, ABODs within the language of the Food Stamp Act. I'm really worried about the Stafford Act as the kind of disaster declaration model, given future presidents or future governors not deciding not to seek federal assistance. So I actually think there's some ways in which a forward-thinking Congress or agencies can change the default rules on when we get additional assistance, especially for the climate crisis. You'll see some states will say landlords cannot evict people or the utilities can't shut off folks' electricity if the temperature gets above 105 degrees, or there's a NOAA air quality advisory. And that gets us away from relying on elected officials that might not be particularly responsive to low-income folks in a given state in a given year.
That's countervailing power. I want to raise the possibility that a certain aggregation of the claims within administrative adjudication may be a feature that potentially serves a lot of the values we have on the table right now. I think a typical feature is we think about adjudicating claims, whether they are permit applications or grant applications, in your case, on a one-by-one basis. I wonder whether this often impedes a lot of the values we're all talking about. So we had a topic across the hall yesterday on permitting and renewable energy. We should have made you this sorry. The thing that the lawyers who presented there were kind of transactional renewable energy lawyers, the thing they were most excited about happening in the country right now is bills passed in New York, California, and Michigan that aggregate citing from local to the state level. And part of what we're like about this, you can really understand this as more technocratic, more capacity to use exact terms. I think you could also think about it as more democracy, and sense more opportunity for input and countervailing position taking by those who would benefit from such projects that are not within the narrow set of people most directly affected because they are the neighbors of it. And so I wonder, especially in the individual's countervailing power framework, what you make of that kind of design option to aggregate many claims together, potentially bringing in people who oppose or support other people's direct adjudications. And is that part of what you can find the countervailing power? And also, where does that fit into Zach's thinking?
I'll say something brief. I mean, I think that aggregation absolutely can be a really useful way to think about sort of how to kind of overcome some of these issues. So one feature, as I was thinking about Zach's paper, the sort of power of the executive and the power to plan, is that if you don't have counterparties who can in fact participate in that planning and in a coherent way and represent different kinds of interests in the sort of corporatist model that so the fact that the Europeans succeed at this may have something to do with corporatism and not just on the side of the governmental power, but on the side of organized social power. And so, so finding ways to not have highly individualistic sort of the litigation model is like so individual, right? So like there's like one homeowner that can stand on they stand on a mountain and rain down upon like that's a very different vision than I think the vision behind our paper, which in fact, we didn't really talk about this much, but we sort of borrowing some from Kate and Ben's work, think about ideally this countervailing powers express themselves in mass organizations that can themselves consolidate on their terms as opposed to sort of the design of some administrator, the kind of and consolidate the kind of power that they represent. And so I think it's a really important insight. And I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add 2 sentences there, which is that I think it's a worthwhile impulse. So much of our understanding of what adjudication requires from a doctrinal perspective is what does it take at a minimum to bind a party? And I think we sort of reject that as a premise for understanding how we should understand democratic input into industrial policy. We're more interested in how do you get perspectives that are otherwise not organized into a fashion to participate in the first place into that policymaking process. So to the extent aggregations enables that. it's worthwhile.
I mean, this is a weird crosswalk to the Civ Pro conversations that we may know some people think about, but like, the fact that we have done so much to undermine aggregate litigation may also be something to put on the table here. One thing that I've just been teaching about AI and copyright in my IP class, and the AI industry is hoping that the classes get certified because they cannot actually aggregate all the copyright claims unless they get class certification, and then they can litigate the whole en masse, right? So there might also be ways to think about what's wrong with our litigation system insofar as it's still going to remain a component of this, and how to think about aggregation of claims there as well.
Yeah, I love that framing, aggregation as one important piece for having better planning and better empowerment of representative groups. I think that you don't want to go too far. At some point, you aggregate so much, you kind of lose the very parties who are impacted by that. So it's tough with climate because the whole whole world is in fact impacted by it. But yeah, I think that Amy put it very well. That we want to move away from the idea that one person can slow down for years, something that thousands or millions of people would benefit from, and aggregating up the states, and I think often federal level. So like cross states, transmission of power. That should not be with the states. That should be with the feds. We do that for oil pipelines. We should also do that for transmission, for electricity. I think that's a similar principle, and I think that that's actually something that could plausibly happen in the next couple of years, and that'd be great too.
So one thing I love about this panel is the first two panels really threw down the gauntlet in any way of like, if we're really serious about the values we say we want to advance, like we're going to have to really think sort of rethink top to bottom, right? How a lot of our institutions are designed. But the real richness on that here. So I have one observation and then a question for Salih's really, well, for Salih, but really for all of you. I mean, I think we have now on the table actually quite a few different definitions of what it really means to call something public. And that's a question for you on this side. So one is the ownership, another is mission and function, a third is who is actually being served, right? And your point, we're not actually serving set of people, this picks up threads from Karen and others from the beginning, then we can't in any real sense call it public, right? And then the fourth is some kind of checks and balances, but not necessarily the like retail level participation, talking about maybe it's aggregated claims, maybe it's countervailing power of the kind Amy and Joel are talking about. And so that I offer as an observation, because I find that really helpful. And then my question for Salih is, I wasn't so clear on whether you thought the distinction between ownership and function, the convening public, is ownership still a necessary but insufficient condition for you for it to be public, or does it not necessarily matter that really the core thing is it operating at the scale and for the purpose desired, right? Because I think that would then have implications for generalizing beyond the banking context.
I think this is dead. They're all dead.
Well, this one's not.
All right. I was about to jump into my professorial mode, which is like yell at people. So Sabil, first of all, it's a great observation about the nature of what publicness is, and Amy and I kind of talked about it a little bit, and there is definitely a lot of work to be done with it. In terms of ownership of function, the sort of, I didn't spend too much time in the paper on that because it's kind of like a little bit of a throat clearing in a way, right? But to me, ownership is important. It is absolutely kind of that first sort of, let's say, creates a rebuttable presumption, right, of publicness. But the interesting question is why, right? And the why, it goes to the point of the structure of the incentives. And this is the more important part, right? So if the ownership is by private shareholders, then we know that the incentive will be to maximize the profits of those shareholders. And there is absolutely no law anywhere that would basically adjudicate the conflict between that private interest and any kind of public interest, right? Unless it's some kind of an emergency, I don't know, the Defense Production Act or something like that. because it's incredible how many times in our legal and institutional system, right, whenever there is that hybridity, where private institution is expected to produce some public benefit, we kind of tiptoe around that issue. But what if there is no perfect alignment? So you have to prioritize. We sort of kind of tiptoe, and in reality, of course, they prioritize private. So if you don't have that kind of private shareholder ownership, then you remove that misalignment. However, just because you do have public ownership doesn't necessarily give you what is the reason for wanting that public ownership. In other words, there could be capture, there could be all kinds of issues that basically never gets us where we need to be.
Last question. Okay, well then we'll just thank our panelists.